Very soon, 4 out of 5 North Americans will be living in cities, living in an environment that owes much more to man than it does to nature. What then should tomorrow's cities be like? Do we want to live like the 30 million people in and around New York and Tokyo? Should we allow Montreal and Toronto to go on sprawling until they blend together, until one could be a citizen of a single megalopolis or supercity that held the Montreal Forum and the Royal Ontario Museum and Queen's University at Kingston and thousands of French, English, Italian, and Chinese restaurants, all within an hour's travel from the city center? Do we want that? Well, tonight in a special hour-long program, we're going to discuss the world's largest cities with an international roster of experts and look ahead to a Canadian supercity of tomorrow. To help us coordinate our footnotes on the future of city life, Telescope welcomes Konstantinos Doxiadis, a celebrated community planner from Athens. William Conklin, a city planner in New York. In Montreal, Moshe Safdie, creator of Habitat. Author Ray Bradbury in Los Angeles. James Murray, Toronto architect and planner. Also in Toronto, architect John Andrews. Marshall McLuhan, communications philosopher. And John Kettle, our resident futurist. In just a few moments, these and other experts will join director Colin Smith as Telescope's color cameras explore the future of life in the supercity.
In just the last half-century or so, 2 places on Earth have become very densely populated. The densest is Tokyo-Yokohama district, which is called Hein, where 16 million people now live. Less dense, but rather bigger, is the area called Boss Wash, which stretches from Boston to Washington. New York is in that area. Nearly 40 million people are living there in an area of 6,000 square miles. A lot of people know what Tokyo and New York, Boss Wash are like. The question is that the sort of thing we want to happen in our cities? Do we want to have a vast, spreading metropolis or megalopolis from Montreal to Toronto? Do we want to try to squeeze 15 million people along the north shore of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River? If we don't want that, what do we want? And whatever we want, how are we going to get it?
What do we ask for these cities that we cluster in? Well, I guess we ask them other things that they work. And this raises a serious question of whether the immense emerging urbanizations of the 20th century are coming to a point where, in a sense, they do not work. Can they get so huge that the focusing of energies trips them up on themselves? Still, people must ask that their cities work, that they work functionally in terms of moving around, in employment, in places to live, in places for recreation. This the city must do, and if it fails to do this, of course, it's in for dire trouble.
Cities like New York and Tokyo tell us a great deal about the problems that we will face in any metropolitan city in the coming 30, 40 years. To start with, we have cities which, because of their sheer size, have become unmanageable. And this has basically meant a breakdown of the transportation system, a restriction on the mobility of the individual. So instead of having more choice and more facilities because you're living in a great city with 10 or 15 million other people, you have less choice because you can't get to it.
If we deprive ourselves of ample time, we die. We are squeezed to death, and time is now spent much more on the road. Not productive, not pleasant. On the contrary, leading to nervousness, to tension, so that by the time we reach our office in the morning, we need a cup of coffee. We feel already exhausted by the effort before we start our day's work. Or we want to measure life in the city in terms of natural elements, the air we breathe, the water we drink or we see in our rivers, or the water in which we are supposed to swim in the small lakes, they are all polluted, contaminated. No matter how you look at life in the city, it has become, from the point of view of living, more difficult and very often worse.
We want a city in which we can move with dignity from one place to the other, meet other people. We want a city that has the great meeting place where we can all come and meet each other, where we can have a rich life as a society, and at the same time have the choice of retreating into our house with full privacy, of being alone in our own dwelling, in our own house, away from the meeting place. I think we want a city that within 10 or 15 minutes permits us to get away from it and be in the open country and be in a sailboat on a lake or walking in the woods. And unless we have the choice of the two, the meeting place and the privacy, the community and the isolation, the density and the total open country, the city does not function the way it should be functioning.
The reasons that man first gathered together in his cities are reasons that to some degree are still important today. I think he gathered in cities sometimes for defense. I think he gathered in cities sometimes because they straddled the trade routes of the world. I think he gathered in cities sometimes because they were centers for administration of ancient empires. I think he gathered in cities sometimes because those cities were in locations where there were natural resources that gave a reason for the city in manufacturing and in commerce.
The great cities you think of that are fun to be in are places where people can walk and mingle and look and be looked at. When I think of Rome, I think of walking in the Via Veneto, being able to sit out by day or night, the twilight hour, which is beautiful. When I think of Paris, I think of 10,000 open-air restaurants in a city where the weather is miserable. When I think of London, I think of 1,000 places to walk. Los Angeles is a good example of a modern city where you can do very little of these. I think there are only 4 or 5 major restaurants out in the open. So the social tension cannot be released. One of the problems of the big cities and why we have sort of roving gangs of people is because they have nowhere to go. The automobile has set them free to wander in our society, but all they do is wander up and down, honking their horns. They have nowhere to sit. They have no open-air places. They have no plazas. They have no places open late enough at night. So they can do the most honorable, the most natural thing in the world, stare at one another and be stared at.
We deal with huge dimensions. In the past, even the biggest city of the world, the most famous one, had up to 50,000 people. Athens, under Pericles in the Golden Era, Rome, Paris, London, within the walls, had never more than 50,000 people. My hometown of Athens, Greece, with 2.5 million people, grows by 18 dwellings an hour. So during the 2-hour meeting of the municipal council, the city is different, by 36 dwellings.
Today, we are among the first generations of really urban people.
The new acceleration of travel tends to push the metropolitan membrane, or stretch it, right around the planet. The herb orbs, literally. So that, in effect, if not in theory, there really is only one city on the planet itself. And all the metropolitan areas are within easy travel distance of one another now. And so the herb orbs by the simple speed up of jet travel and becomes a single service environment. By the same token, the orb herbs. It contracts. Speed up doesn't enlarge. It greatly reduces the size of any operation. And so many people have the feeling of a population explosion resulting from the reduction of the size of the planet. It has nothing to do with the number of people on the planet. But if everything suddenly speeds up, you quickly have the feeling that everybody's sitting on top of you.
Urbanization is a new catchword. Planners use it, statisticians use it. turning open country into cities. So it also, by definition, it's come to mean moving people into cities. In the first sense, Canada is hardly urbanized at all. I suppose a 200th or a 300th part of our land surface is cities. The rest is open. In another sense, as far as the population is concerned, we're very urbanized. Half the people in Canada live in cities of 75,000 or more. It's a very big figure.
People who are born into city life. They're not people who have opted out of the countryside to come into the city. They didn't come in for defense. Indeed, God knows they may leave the city in order to preserve themselves for defense. But we have to remember that the growth of cities today is not necessarily a pro-city vote, but just because the city is the way of life today.
The people who are moving from rural America into New York or Chicago or Detroit are really moving into a better situation than they had before, because they're coming out of the South, coming out of Mississippi and Alabama, the rural parts of those states. They're coming out of the Appalachian Plateau, and these are very grim, dark, rural slums, where the schools are bad, where income on the farms is miserable, and where if a man is without work, he has no welfare, he has no public assistance. So bad as conditions may be in Detroit, or bad as conditions may be in Harlem, in New York, Bedford, Stuyvesant, and Brooklyn, they're still better than they are in western Tennessee or northern Alabama or the uplands of Mississippi.
We read about troubles in Paris or troubles in Glasgow and perhaps even troubles in Toronto. And it might almost lead us to a rather pessimistic view that somehow the cities have gone sour and that these are the focuses of the things that trouble us. But perhaps in a more optimistic view, we could more correctly say that really wherever anything is happening of importance, it is happening in the cities.
Telescope resumes its footnotes on the future of life in the supercity in just 1 minute.
It's easy to tell what it's like living in today's cities, but let's say New York. What would it be like for a young man living there, working there?
I guess I had a typical country-type life. I went to a very small grade school with about 20 students in each class. But, I enjoyed mainly because it was open. If I wanted to play softball, I had a field. There was always a field available to play football or whatever. After I left high school, I went to Harper College in Binghamton, New York, and finished out my education there, where I met my wife, and I then moved to New York City. I think the main reason I did move was because of the entertainment that was available here. I have about 5 to 10 minute walk to the subway at 190th Street, and I take the A train, which takes me maybe 20, 25 minutes to get down to 59th Street. Then I have to change over to the 6th Avenue train for 4 or 5 stops, and then switch again to the BMT. Total trip is about 40, 45 minutes. You're very lucky if you get a seat. There's no courtesy involved. It's just to push and get in as fast as you can. I don't look forward to it. I'm glad when I'm off. When I first came to New York, I didn't even have a job. I looked in a paper and I knew I wanted to be a programmer. And I saw an ad and went down, and 2 or 3 days later I had the job. They send you to what they call a compiler class. It's a language that the programmer uses to make it easy for him. In other words, the machine only understands numbers. And so they have a compiler so that you can write in English, and it is compiled and changed into computer language. In other words, it goes from words and transferred from words into numbers. My day is a fairly simple day. I usually write programs, test programs, or correct programs that have already been written. One of the worst problems I've found in the city is that people are in a sort of a hectic type of pace. Nobody really cares about what anybody else thinks.
Boswash is the ugly name of the ugly city that we've been creating between Boston and Washington here on the East Coast. The problems that it has are pretty well known to all of us. But to me, as a physical planner, there are underlying problems of the the physical nature of how this has been organized that I feel are really at the root of the problems that are the ones that make the headlines.
If you consider the way we plan and build our cities today, it's basically a two-dimensional pattern. If we consider a typical downtown area, say in Montreal or Toronto, and draw a section through it, we will have office buildings, we may have some apartment buildings, and these are arbitrarily arranged. In fact, if you want to go from this building to that building, you have to go down, you have to go across, you get in the way of the cars, and you have to go up again. You get apartments in the shadow of office buildings, and you get parking garages overtowering shopping streets. And so if we took the same thing and said, well, we can design the city not as a two-dimensional subdivision of land with individual buildings, but as a total entity, as a total urban organism, and we can subdivide space so that we take, say, the apartments and we make them into houses in space, arranged in such a juxtaposition so that they have view and sun and maximum benefit of the elements. And then in the areas which are formed below, we can have shopping promenades and offices, and we separate the pedestrians and the cars so that each of these functions of the city, which in the two-dimensional plan destroyed each other, interfered with each other, can start complementing each other. We can get a better environment by giving ourselves the freedom to plan three-dimensionally.
Well, I'm fascinated by the relationship of the city to design. I seriously wonder if, thank God, the city will forever escape design. It's so huge, it's so multifaceted, its problems are so interrelated and open-ended that I'm rather convinced that there is no such thing as the ideal city. And I'm also rather convinced that you can't, quote, design a city.
Now, what happens if we try to build a perfect plan? Almost inevitably, we build it for our own generation in our own time. Tomorrow, however, that generation has changed. Some people have died, some have been born. The time has changed. A city has to be dynamic because people who live in it are dynamic. The population, the community, society is dynamic, which almost prevents you having a perfect solution, unless your solution is itself an ever-changing, rolling, progressing thing in which a different lot of people can live a life that we couldn't even predict when we started to build that city.
I'm sadly reminded that there is a distinguished American city, I believe, in Texas, where there is no planning and no zoning bylaws, and it's rather difficult to see where it looks any different than the most highly structured city. But I do believe that the planning process is essential as our cities are getting more complicated. It's rather interesting to think, you know, of how much of the land of a Canadian city is really in the public ownership. If you add up the schools and the roads and the parks and the institutions, I would imagine you'd find that something like 40% of a Canadian city is mutually owned, as it were, by the public. So we have this fascinating problem which strikes at basic propositions of the powers of planning, the powers of group decision as they compare with the powers and prerequisites of individual decisions.
I've recently been involved in the replanning of the railway area for CN and CP, the railway trackage area in downtown Toronto. Now, moving from the overall plan of the region, we see a vastly increased warehouse and industrial thing to the east. The Toronto Islands retained basically as recreational, but a proposed new airport on the point of the islands, this being an intercity airport, Montreal, New York, short-range jets, DC-9s and 727s and things, leaving Toronto Harbour somewhat reduced in size. But all of these things then closely related to the CNCP site. Having an intercity airport here means that all of the forms of transportation that serve a city are concentrated and related to the Canadian Pacific, Canadian national area. Now, there are a number of different forms of transportation involved in here. There's the long-distance trains and GO trains, as outlined with the thin line. There is the automobile system, which is outlined by the red line. There's a pedestrian system, the blue in here. Even between these systems, you've got the different scales, for instance, of the automobile, Front Street being a 30-mile-an-hour scale, the Gardiner Expressway being a 60-mile-an-hour scale.
And then in the midst of that again, the subway itself coming much further south than the current loop. Just the impact of 50, 90,000 people coming by GO train into an area at a particular time in the day immediately can set a condition whereby by organizing pedestrian movement, this becomes quite economically feasible for a major shopping development. Other aspects of the plan are convention center, trade mart, communication tower, and a very, very substantial housing complex to accommodate some 10,000 people. The actual architecture is not terribly significant. It is the organization at the levels of movement that becomes terribly important as from the point of view of creating an open-ended planning framework, a framework that can change as time goes by. A very substantial automobile arrival and departure system has to be arranged to accommodate the long-distance trains. There's no question that there will be a resurgence of long-distance train travel, particularly as we get into turbo trains and the more high-speed intercity trains. This scale of problem is by no means unique to Toronto, and some of the attitudes expressed here are those which we might expect to find being used in other parts of the world.
These apartments are typical of the type of apartments that are available in New York City, in the heart of the city. You see, they're very close together and the area is very noisy. I myself have moved uptown sort of to get away from this closeness and the noise. Many of the apartments reasonably priced are walk-ups. They have no elevators. Because there's a lot of industry in the city has a tendency to be very, very dirty. You can't leave your windows open. Another problem, which doesn't really bother me as much as my wife, is the fact she's very worried about burglaries. Even though I live uptown now and the area is much nicer than, say, the area down here, when I decide to raise a family, I'm going to want to get out of New York City itself. Although there are these disadvantages of the city, at this time the city, for me, is the place to live. I enjoy it, and it's actually where the action is, and it's very enjoyable to live here, and I can put up with the disadvantages because of the things that are available to me in the city.
I think today we are entering a phase where the average family with an average income and 2 and 3 children just has no choice but to move to the outskirts of the city and buy a single-family house. But at the same time, it does feel that the qualities of life of being at the outskirts of the city are not sufficient, and so that they continuously converge on the center of the city where all the facilities and the cultural and recreational life is. And so that as a result of this, we get tremendous congestion, and there is just a limit to how long we can keep going, pushing everybody out of the center to the periphery and avoiding the issue.
The density of this development along the lower edge of Manhattan is very high. It's perhaps as high as any portion in New York. But I think that the quality of living will be higher, perhaps, than any that we now have to offer. And it really is going to be achieved because of the fact there won't be any open parking lots and there won't be any highways. And all the land that is available really will be used for playgrounds and recreation areas and human occupancy of all that. And transportation facilities will be entirely invisible. Also because of the fact that it has a great open view across the Hudson River, which makes possible, really, and sensible this kind of high density of development. We no longer have to engage in the old kinds of separation of uses that we once thought was essential to the creation of cities.
2/3 of the people who live in Canada live in their own houses, only 1/3 in apartment buildings. And every survey or study that's been done indicates fairly clearly that most families want their own house, their own garden, and some sort of space and some privacy.
In New York, you have an awful lot of privacy, mainly because people don't go out of their way to sort of find out what the other person is doing. You can live next door to somebody and maybe never even know his name, or maybe only see him once or twice a year. Everybody sort of tends to keep to themselves. I know since I've moved to New York, 90% of the friends that I have were people that I knew before I moved to New York.
privacy is much easier to achieve and is not the most critical problem. After all, in any development, even in the most deteriorated areas of our city, privacy is really possible within a given living unit. It's not the most difficult quality to achieve in a city. I think that though sociability and communication really are the essence of cities and are the most difficult to achieve.
Well, I've lived in villages and I've lived in big cities. I suppose you get about as much privacy in a high-rise apartment house where you don't know the people in the next apartment as you do in a small village where you have a lawn and an old house and a hedge around the lawn, but everybody knows what everybody else is doing behind the hedge.
The way that we dwell today in big cities is, of course, fundamentally changing. We have immense buildings, 30 and 40 stories high, apartment buildings. Are these monolithic banalities crushing in their effect on the people that live in them? I don't think necessarily.
There's a great deal of talk about technology and industrializing housing construction today, and it's important to try and point out why we need to introduce mass production and industrialization into the construction of housing. Production lines manufacturing the modules, sub-assemblies manufacturing bathrooms and kitchens and heating systems, and every step of the construction, from installation of mechanical equipment or electrical equipment to the windows and the painting and the finishing and even some of the furnishing, is done in the factory, shipped by truck or by barge, finally arriving at the site, the modules being assembled in the fastest possible way with just simple connections being made from one module to the other.
I hear people talk about having an individual home, individual dwelling. They're very independent, but if you take a great hydraulic ram, that's great water hose, and you wash out all the earth around all the houses that call themselves independent, you find they're all just fancy nozzles on the same sewage systems.
And when you see that a space capsule with 2 men in it can exist for 14 days in space and completely handle all the mechanical sewage, etc. requirements, then you look at a normal house and you see that the half of the basement is taken up with the furnace and the pipes and the ducts and things of this nature. I think we have to give much more thought to this form of machinery before we're really going to be able to become a part of the space age, which in my mind the factory-made house pretty much requires.
Well, in Habitat we experimented with two basic ideas. One was the modular construction element, which is a factory-produced element, and the other was trying to create a high-density environment which had many of the amenities of a single-family house within a multi-story, three-dimensional grouping. But Habitat was quite primitive in the sense that we used a simple box, we grouped it in rather simple formations. And in the 3 or 4 projects that have generated from Habitat, we have been able to take this a step further. Puerto Rico is a very good example of one of these developments. This is a site which is a hill in the center of San Juan, and we have used the hill to build directly on it so that the roads spiral up the hill, and you have the grouping of the dwellings in such a way that you are not dependent on elevators. Here you see the whole community of 800 families with a shopping center and open-air amphitheater on the top of the hill. The pedestrian street interweaves through the project, and it's totally separated from vehicular traffic. You walk along it and enter your own house through the private entrance through an entrance court. And here we have the view of a terrace, a garden, which is more like a court or an atrium for the tropical climate. It's on the roof of the unit below it, and it overlooks the city. We developed a split-level module, which can be shipped by truck because it's wide enough for highway clearance, and yet it produces its own stair inside the module instead of having a freestanding stair, and so it becomes much more efficient. And then 1, 2, or 3 of these form a dwelling, depending on its size. And these then are grouped into a cluster of 12 dwellings, ranging from 1 to 4 bedrooms in size. When you mix commercial and residential and institutional facilities, you're able to get a much better environment and a much higher density without getting crowding or congestion or interfering of one use with the other.
Expo 67. In many ways, I think it's as fine an illustration as our Western world has to offer on what the city of the future could really be like. There we saw many kinds of transportation planning, all the different facilities for moving people around, and that illustrates the way in which our cities are going to have to work in the future.
It used to be that cities just grew like Topsy. You started off with a village and it turned into a city. But you can't do that today. We need a lot of space quite fast. And this has caused people to start thinking of radical ideas, throwing away the old ideas and inventing cities from scratch. People have thought of satellite cities. People have invented cities which depend entirely on a particular form of transportation. People have devoted whole areas of the city to transportation. There are ideas for squeezing cities over the countryside like toothpaste out of a tube. The ideas sound ridiculous, some of them, and they even look ridiculous when you draw them. But it's reasonable to start looking at ideas like that.
Telescope brings you further footnotes on the future of megalopolitan society in just 1 minute.
Certainly the East Coast is a magnificent coast with its harbors and bays and its waterfront. If we could all imagine what it was like before we created Boswash, I'm sure it was a marvelous place. But during this portion of this century, somehow all has broken down.
Another problem I find living in the city is commuting within the city itself. Although I have a car, I find it very impractical to take it to work or to take it wherever I want to go because parking is very difficult, and if you find a parking space, usually you have to find a lot, and it's very expensive. And also, just coming in and out of the city, it's very congested, and it takes a very long time.
What a noise, what a dirty, polluted place the city is because of the automobile. Cities in our time are really for automobiles. In our generation, but 60 years ago, almost exactly to the day, is when we surrendered our cities to the automobiles.
I am quite often asked, have you seen our last city plan? Yes, sometimes I have, and then the plan is brought in, it is exhibited, and then I ask the officials to tell me about the plan. Well, they say it is a beautiful plan, and then try to ask to understand what does it mean. Has not your Transportation Commissioner made the statement that now you can cross downtown at an average speed by car of 5 miles an hour? They said yes, but was not the speed 9 miles an hour a few years ago? On the basis of the same statement, they say yes, and is this speed not going to be 3 miles an hour in a few years? They say yes. So from the point of view of transportation, the city gets worse. Can our children now run in the streets? They say no, but they have been running in the streets for thousands of years. People were coming to the cities to find safety. Now they have to go to the countryside to find safety. So from what point of view does this plan, I ask, is going to make life for the people better? In very specific terms, in economic, social, political, racial, aesthetic, is there any aspect which is going to be ameliorated? Any aspect of our lives? Then the answer is difficult. We don't ameliorate our cities. We build them into systems which are going to make our life hard.
It's strange that our major architects and city planners would so disregard the need of people to socialize, to slow things down so people will get out of their cars. Tell them to abandon their carapaces, their samurai warrior shields, because that's what a car is. It's a way of disregarding texture, of flashing by the world so fast that you don't see it. You better not see it. You'd better pay attention to the car ahead of you, the car behind you, the car to either side of you, especially on a freeway at 80 miles an hour. Because if you pay attention to the world, you're dead. So the whole thing is a negative thing, a way of thinking murder constantly and being afraid of being murdered yourself constantly. So the big trick now is to take this new invention of ours, this science fictional device, the car, and somehow pry it open with a can opener and take the flesh out and put it on its feet and get it to walking again and looking and smelling and touching and relating to other people. Not to other cars, not to other ways of killing, but to people who don't want to kill when they're out of the carapace.
The whole nature of our civilization calls for an intensification, really, of moving through megalopolis. It's the nature of our civilization. And I think that we will only have a great city when we can find a way to plan transportation facilities so that they don't interrupt other human values and so that they are placed in a way that can serve us and our needs much more effectively than they now do.
To start with, we need very effective, comfortable mass transportation, otherwise it won't be used, and I think that it should be free so that, and paid for from the tax base so that it can compete with other forms of transportation, such as, say, the car. And if you take that a step further, we can design all our transportation systems, personal and public, to be synchronized and coordinated in such a way that one can get off and on from one system to the other in motion. A train may speed up to 60 miles an hour. A regional train may slow down from 400 to 60, and they can run side by side for a couple of minutes as people get on and off them, part again, and go each on their own way. So that the whole system of continuous motion transportation without any stops, very much like a gear system with all the wheels turning at different speeds because they're different sizes, would give us much greater mobility than we have today.
Recent studies here in the United States, for example, which have been completed, prove that it is much better to develop transportation systems in tubes, because it is in the tubes that we are going to have much higher speeds, and the different technologies, depending on the system, they forecast that we can have such systems in operation by the year 1980, the latest. This will give us a unique opportunity to free the surface of the earth, the surface of the city, for man again.
What show should we see?
Whichever one you want to see. I myself would rather see the Beatles.
No, I think I'd rather see the Shoes of the Fisherman.
Oh, and you got to make up your mind one way or the other.
Oh, look at that jacket.
Yeah, I like the double breast.
What's that playing over there in the Victoria?
West Side Story.
Cities are fascinating to most everybody to visit. New York and Tokyo would be the two that come to one's mind most readily as being the extraordinary examples of conglomerations of people. It's interesting to compare New York with Tokyo. New York, you can see the results of some of the frustrations of attempting to experiment with different forms of transportation. The subways have now got to a point where they're considered to be a hazard for old ladies and young girls, and in fact for most everybody. Whereas if you look again to Tokyo, you find that they've had the extraordinary advantage and the good common sense to be able to look at the trials and tribulations of Western cities and maybe pick up the best solutions out of. The bullet train system from Tokyo to Kyoto and Osaka travels at 135 miles an hour. We've been talking about this sort of thing on the North American continent for many years, but the Japanese have done it.
I had a vision. I think I'm going to write a fable about it. I used to write essays and fables and mix them. And I'm going to write a fable about the fact that if you spent a couple of millions of years in paradise, you would like to have a fortnight's vacation in hell.
I hear somewhere that by 1980 that every second Canadian will be living in one of our 5 biggest cities, and 80% of us will be urban birds. So whatever tomorrow brings, it's going to be the basic ingredient of our daily lives.
Now, if you think of Montreal and Toronto, And if you consider that they could become one city, 400 miles long, that we could link them with methods of transportation that move 300, 400, and 500 miles per hour, so that they really are one city, then one could think of these two cities growing not radially, but linearly towards each other, becoming one long linear city.
The system of the Great Lakes megalopolis, which starts in Milwaukee, goes around Chicago to Detroit, to Toledo, to Cleveland and Pittsburgh on the one side, and then to Toronto and to Buffalo to the other side. Toronto is a part of the hugest urban system of the world. Today still people speak of the hugest system as the system between Boston and Washington. If we measure it in terms of present population, it is. If we think of what is going to happen in the year 2000 or the generation to come, then we'll see that the Great Lakes megalopolis is going to be a much larger system with many more problems.
Future cities will have to be designed in units of 100,000 or less. It doesn't mean that that will have to constitute the whole city. The whole economic agglomeration might consist of 4 or 5 of such units arranged like the petals of a flower around some center. But well, there is another reason for picking this figure of 100,000 as the necessary unit. Such a population in the modern world is able to provide within its own borders the greater part of all the commerce and service industries which its inhabitants require. Now, for the whole agglomeration, I would set a maximum of 1 million. I fail to see the advantages of, let's say, a 5 million group over a 1 million group. I don't really see that a 1 million group offers much more than a 500,000 group, and I'm very suspicious if there's anything other than the very basic needs of large transportation requirements.
We know that for some cities, the solution is to stop bringing new forces in. In this way, we'll stop bringing new cars, new pressures, new people. We'll ease the situation by creating a twin city, a twin center, in the same way in which if we have a patient suffering from a heart disease, we first tell him, don't eat more, start eating less, starting taking the pressures off your heart, and then we'll see what we can do, whether we must operate or not. But it is meaningless to deal with your heart as long as you increase the pressures on it.
The idea of city life as compared with tribal life in the world of nature meant to antiquity and to, I think, most civilizations, a kind of magical stepping up of human consciousness. So the city is a prepared environment of services which heighten human awareness and really extend the consciousness of man. So the city as a kind of extension of human consciousness was the normal image of city in all past societies, so that you'll find that nearly all the great poems of the world are concerned with the city as a form, whether it's Homer or Virgil or Dante or Milton.
Jane Jacobs, who wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities, has upset some of the city planners. She's an amateur. She has a very interesting view of what city life is about. I'd like to read you something from her book. In speaking about city sidewalk safety, I mentioned how necessary it is that there should be, in the brains behind the eyes on the street, an almost unconscious assumption of general street support when the chips are down. When a citizen has to choose, for instance, whether he will take responsibility or abdicate it in combating barbarism or protecting strangers. There is a short word for this assumption of support: trust. The trust of a city street is formed over time from many, many little public sidewalk contacts. It grows out of people stopping by at the bar for a beer, getting advice from the grocer and giving advice to the newsstand man, comparing opinions with other customers at the bakery and nodding hello to the 2 boys drinking pop on the stoop, eyeing the girls while waiting to be called for dinner, admonishing the children, hearing about a job from the hardware man and borrowing $1 from the druggist, admiring the new babies and sympathizing over the way a coat faded. Customs vary. In some neighborhoods, people compare notes on their dogs. In others, they compare notes on their landlords.
Now, it's obvious that that is not the uppermost thought in the minds of planners. They think of the city rather as a blueprint, a place where they can locate crowds of people, like a parking lot, or where they can simply fill in enterprises that they can't find space for otherwise. Now, this sort of view of the city as mere content has nothing to do with its form or function as a means of heightening human consciousness. And it may well be that beyond a certain size, the city merely impoverishes human awareness and consciousness and reduces consciousness to a sort of imbecile level.
Perhaps the basic design dilemma of the city stems back to something very, very fundamental. Most of the design tasks, a desk or a room or a house or a church, something of that fashion, is a design task which is related to the individual, to the person, and therefore it's understandable and within grasp, and good designers know how to cope with it. But the city is an expression, presumably, of the total life, the total inter-involvement of many, many individuals. And therefore, in a curious sense, although a city is obviously so much the creation of a way of life, a technology, a sociology, and economics of its time, at the same time, there is really no way in which you can close in on it as a human exercise as you do close in on the design of a school for little children. So we're troubled by this problem in city design, the dilemma between keeping in view the person. Jane Jacobs talks about the eyes on the sidewalk, and keeping in view also the mass operations which are consequent on hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of people trying to occupy the same rather limited acreage.
Telescope will be back with a preview of next week's report on the perils and promises of the underdeveloped world, and the names of the people behind the cameras on tonight's program in just 1 minute. Next week, Telescope continues its footnotes on the future with a report on a major concern of mankind today, the hungry and poor of the underdeveloped world, 2/3 of our present population. A number of distinguished public figures offer us a revealing mosaic of comment and opinion on this important problem.
In the 50s and in the 60s, a lot of the money for foreign aid, a lot of the appropriations for foreign aid came not out of compassion, but out of anti-communism.
Until next week, Fletcher Markle for Telescope.
Telescope was brought to you by your telephone company, part of the Trans-Canada Telephone System, a world of communications progress at your fingertips. And by Great West Life, a great friend for your family.